For the last few years, I've been working inside the precious metals world, so in a role that gives me a front row seat to how ordinary, financially responsible people behave when they feel uncertain about the future. And there's a pattern I can't unsee anymore, which goes something like this. So a bad headline hits, inflation spikes, a bank wobbles, war escalates, and suddenly traffic spikes like there's this frantic scramble to buy as much silver and gold as possible. People who haven't thought about gold in 10 years are urgently asking how to buy it. And people who've never owned assets outside a savings account are suddenly desperate to do something before it's too late. Then the news cycle moves on, the markets calm down, the panic fades, people go back to work, they go back to their routines, and back to assuming that things will just more or less sort themselves out until the next shock arrives and the entire cycle repeats. What struck me most is that people are responding episodically to a problem that is not episodic at all, because beneath the headlines and the fear spikes and market noise, something far more structural has been shifting. I mean, this is actually not recent. It has been going on for quite a few years, but a growing number of people sense that the old rules don't govern the way they used to, meaning that while effort still matters, it no longer compounds in the way they were promised. So this means that you can do everything right and still not see any real forward momentum. So most middle-class professionals haven't fully accepted this yet. They still interpret what's happening as a series of temporary crises. And what they haven't grasped is that pretty much since the early 2000s, all the more pronounced since COVID, we are living inside a very different economic regime. So essentially, we moved from an economy where wages were sufficient for building asset exposure to one where asset ownership is increasingly decoupled from wages. So for much of the post-war period, a decent salary was enough to slowly acquire assets like a home or maybe some stocks or gold. All that was really required was consistency, like just keep going to work and saving up a portion of your income. That link has weakened. Asset prices have risen far faster than incomes, and access to ownership now increasingly depends on existing capital or on family help or early positioning, not just career progression, which changes the whole experience of effort itself. In a wage-led economy, effort compounds. So you go to work, you gain experience, you get promoted, your income rises, and your life gradually moves forward. In an asset-led economy, effort still matters, but no longer, it doesn't sit at the center of the compounding process. So assets compound, capital compounds, ownership compounds, while wages mostly tread water, which means you can do everything right in behavioral terms. You can study, you can build a career, you can avoid obvious mistakes, you can live very sensibly and still find yourself standing in roughly the same place. And this is what I notice in these daily conversations. It's really that a growing number of people feel this, even if they don't have the language for it. They sense that stability has become conditional, that forward momentum is no longer the default, and they often have no idea what to invest in. They just know that keeping it in cash is not how you retain value anymore. So over the last 2 decades, the economy has become increasingly financialized. The key shift, as I see it, is that growth has been driven less by cost-reducing innovation and much more by credit expansion, asset appreciation, and monetary intervention. I know I'm not just talking about the US here. This is very much also the case in Germany. So money has been made cheaper, liquidity has increased, and the primary beneficiaries of that environment have been those who already own appreciating assets. This is where the lived experience really begins to split. So if your economic life is anchored to wages, you feel the pressure everywhere, like housing just pulls further and further away. Savings struggle to keep pace. Long-term plans require much more caution, more contingency, and more delay. Even if you get a pay rise at work, say like 10 or even 15%, which is way above the average in Europe, it rarely feels decisive. Like it doesn't really make a meaningful difference because of the basic the rise in basic essentials. On the other hand, if your economic life is anchored to compounding assets, the very same environment feels buoyant. Like inflation lifts nominal values, periodic crises, they are absorbed and reversed. Your wealth just grows without needing constant input. And this basically all means that time works very differently for you. And yeah, so while assets are always potential wealth, like it only counts when you actually sell them, the fact that they keep going up in value, and granted, you have a diversified portfolio of different assets, so it's not like all in a house or in tech stocks, then this does just give you a certain sense of security. Inflation sits at the center of this shift, but not in the way it's usually discussed. So the issue isn't simply that prices rise, it's that inflation combined with sustained monetary expansion that changes which parts of the economy compound fastest. So future income is negotiated and earned in nominal terms, while purchasing power erodes in real terms. So in other words, your salary might, if you're lucky, update, so it updates on a yearly basis. Maybe you get a slight pay rise every year, but the cost of living updates constantly. And existing assets, also by contrast, they tend to reprice upward as liquidity expands. So the result is a system that increasingly rewards ownership more reliably than labor alone. And this happens without anyone being told. So a lot of capable, disciplined professionals, they feel disoriented. They're playing by rules that still exist culturally, but they do not dominate economically, which is where the panic cycle comes in, because people have not taken the time to understand the underlying changes in the economy. So we've moved into an era where outcomes are shaped not only by how hard you push inside the system, but increasingly by where you're positioned relative to its compounding forces. So until that is properly understood, people will keep experiencing the same unease and probably keep blaming themselves for something that is really no longer under their control. So the mistake that the middle class made over the last 20 years was assuming continuity. So they assumed the system they were trained for would still exist by the time they reached the middle of it. So that the rules they internalized early on, like getting educated, being hardworking, getting the promotion, sort of sticking it out to seniority, those kind of things, that those things would continue to govern outcomes. And that if they followed the same path as their parents, they would arrive somewhere familiar. This is why in many high-income countries, millennials have accumulated less wealth and often earned less than previous generations did at the same age. This is really a pattern that reflects systemic structural changes in labor markets, in housing costs and asset dynamics. So the problem was never effort, it was always alignment. And because they were performing very well, but inside a system that had already stopped paying out in the same way. For 2 decades, wages have increasingly just stabilized life rather than advanced it. Career progression, it still matters, but it mostly just protects your position. It rarely transforms it. On the other hand, assets like housing or equities or a business or gold or something like that, they have absorbed the compounding effects of liquidity, of low rates, and monetary expansion. So that divergence reshaped outcomes, even though many things still look very similar on the surface of it. Most middle-class professionals kept playing by the previous model, which is to optimize the CV, to negotiate harder, maybe to switch companies, and to keep taking on more and more responsibility. But the uncomfortable realization is this: security no longer emerges automatically from professional competence alone. So what changes? Well, of course, none of what I've said is financial advice. It's just my opinion. Of course, you should do your own research. But first, I would stop treating assets as speculative add-ons and start treating them as structural. Ownership, however small, however tiny it may be, it needs to become a part of the baseline strategy, and it really needs to stop being a reaction to panic headlines. Second, and this one is quite uncomfortable, but in this current economic environment, there is a need to update your risk perception. So the old middle class instinct was caution. It was, to save cash and to avoid volatility. It was all about stability and playing it safe. But in an inflationary and asset-driven environment, excessive caution really becomes the actual risk. So obviously don't be reckless, but you do need a certain amount of exposure. Thirdly, I would detach identity from employment alone. So in a financialized system, your job is no longer the sole engine of upward mobility. It is just one pillar among several. That psychological shift actually matters more than most people realize, because it is the start of behavioral changes. And finally, just stop blaming yourself for not feeling ahead despite working hard. The confusion isn't a personal failure. It really is just a structural misalignment. So the last 20 years saw a redistribution. Well, some people talk about a redistribution of wealth, like especially since the pandemic. I prefer to think of it as a redistribution of compounding, because the way the economy is structured right now, it rewards asset ownership above everything else. So you can get angry at that, you can say that it is immoral or wrong, or you can set yourself up to benefit from how the economy actually works. So when I observe these panic cycles at work now, the rush into gold, the frantic headlines, the sudden certainty that something is, there's an imminent collapse. I don't see that as irrationality or like crazy behavior. I see people really trying to protect themselves inside a system they haven't fully mapped. And so the urgency makes total sense if you've spent your life believing that effort guarantees security, and you begin to feel that security slipping despite your continued hard work and effort, then your nervous system will look for something solid to hold onto. And whether that's gold or property or cash, whatever feels real in that moment, you will gravitate towards it. So the mistake isn't fear. The mistake is treating a structural shift as a temporary emergency, because emergencies demand a reaction. Structural shifts demand repositioning. So I know this is a little different to what I usually make videos about, but I think it is extremely important, as it has cascading influence on all areas of life, especially on culture, politics, and society. And I think it really needs to be talked about more, because it really explains a lot of issues that Europe is facing right now. So let me know what your thoughts are. Tell me in the comments below. If you found this interesting, you might want to check out this video here next. Other than that, take care, take it easy. I will see you next time. Bye.